This parable of Jesus we're going to look at today needs no introduction, so I won't give it any. I'm just going to jump right into the passage. I'm entitling the message, The Father and His Two Sons, because this isn't only about one wasteful son. It's about dad and two sons, to get the whole story. In fact, well, I'll just read it. Let's just go to it, the passage. I'm going to start in Luke 15, verse 11, and I'm going to read the entire passage because I believe there's power in reading the passage. Okay? And it's a very familiar story to many, but it isn't familiar to everybody. So let's look at it. Now, I give you one assignment as we're reading through this. I want you to look and listen for things that you haven't seen in this passage before. Every time I read this, I see something different. Not that the main story changes, but that there's something I missed in previous reading. So anyway, I'll start with verse 11, Luke chapter 15. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And when he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" The story begins with a man had two sons. Do you realize how common that is in the Bible? A man had two sons. Adam had two sons. The older, Cain, killed the younger because of jealousy. Abraham had two sons. One, Ishmael, the firstborn, who received a lesser blessing, and Isaac, the secondborn, who received the greatest of blessings. Isaac had two twins, Esau and Jacob, in that order. The older Esau was a hunter, hairy, rugged looking, reddish in appearance, while Jacob was a homebody, fair-complected and loved to cook. And the younger son received the inheritance, the full measure of the inheritance. So now the younger son asks for the inheritance early, enraging his older brother, as we find out later. This part of the story has always puzzled me a bit. I think one of the great dangers to knowing a story really well is sometimes we miss the obvious things because we've read them over so many times. Charles Hodge, the old preacher from way back when, used to say that familiar scriptures need to be studied more carefully. And I agree with him here. But why did the father consent to do such a thing? I mean, think about this. Wasn't this foolish? Didn't he have some idea that his son didn't have the maturity to do this? And besides, is it possible that he was wishing his father dead? I mean, this kind of insult that you would ask your father for part of his estate early? In fact, that word estate means life. That was his life. That's his dad's life he's asking for. The word is bios. We get the word biology from that. That's the word estate. It's all that the father had done in his life, all the things that he had accumulated, the things that he'd worked for, and this boy who had done nothing to earn it. That's what inheritances are. You know, you don't earn an inheritance. It's a gift from your parents, if you're blessed enough to get one. But here he has gone in asking for his inheritance early. Now, some will say, well, this was obviously he was wishing his daddy dead. It was a slap in the face to his father. I did a little extra, and I've taught that before. I'm not sure that's the case anymore, after having done a little bit more study. Some Jewish experts who have looked at this passage from the first century say that that's not necessarily what was going on here. That he just wanted to set up his own life. He wanted to live his own life. But in fact, it's very doubtful, isn't it, that if it had been a sin, that his father would have allowed him to do that? Is that possible? Well, I think it's possible to microanalyze a parable, and really, parables are meant to be understood, not microanalyzed. And I think you can get caught in some tall grass there in looking at this. To understand a parable, you have to get to the end of the story to get the message. The story does not end with the prodigal son coming home. You notice that? The story is left hanging. The brother is so angry, so mad at his little brother for having humiliated the family, humiliated his dad, took half of what was his dad's life and wasted it, and of course frames it in the worst possible terms, saying he'd squandered it with prostitutes, and who's to say that he wasn't right? That would be disgraceful enough. But he leaves it there. They're having this party. Dad's already thrown the party. You notice he did not ask his older son's permission to throw the party. He just threw it. It's his son, you know. His son who had been dead is now alive. So, the boy is standing out in the field. He's found out what the music and dancing is all about. And Dad goes out and pleads with him to go in. And the boy lays it all out. Number one, he let the youngest leave without permission, with no strings attached. Number two, he split the estate with his other son. And thirdly, the father had been disgraced by his son. And yet he blesses him. And the young man was off on his own. He eventually ran out of money, became desperate enough to feed pigs, and if that isn't bad enough, There's a drought. He goes from desperate to hopeless. He's so hungry. He thinks about eating the slop he's feeding pigs. And it says then he came to his senses, which is probably the nicest thing that's said about the younger son in this story. He came to his senses. He correctly reasons that the hired servants at his dad's table were eating better than him. And he thought about what he needed to tell his dad to even have a chance of having a place at the table. I thought as Ellis was speaking about the table, a table of grace, that this is exactly the picture here of the prodigal and the great celebration, the big party. That actually the Lord's Supper is a great banquet feast of celebration for our salvation in Jesus. That's what it's all about. And that everyone who surrenders to Him is welcome at this table, no matter what they've done, where they've been, how they've made a mess of things, how they've wasted their livelihoods, no matter how they've wasted their lives. And he made his way home after rehearsing what he would tell his dad. He would admit that he was a total failure. He would confess his sins. He would admit his sin against God. He would admit his unworthiness to be accepted back into the family as a full son, and would ask to be made a mere hired servant. He made his way home, and while it says that he was still a long way off, his dad saw him and ran to meet him. And he embraced his son, who had humiliated him, who still smelled of the pigsty. He embraced him. And he said, "Here's a ring, just so you'll know you're still in the family, and here's some shoes for your feet because you look like a slave when you're barefoot." He got him new robes, and he said, "We're going to have a veal dinner." And so they had a veal cookout and a banquet. They butchered a fresh calf and had food and dancing and music. And the older son in the field is missing it all because he's still mad at his little brother for what he had done. You see, he'd been faithful. He'd stayed home. He worked. His brother had been unfaithful. His brother had left home. His brother had partied. Everything that he had not done, his brother had done, and he was so bitter. There was nothing just or fair about any of this. I always get a little worried when people start saying, "We need justice." Oh, justice is for somebody else, not for us, right? We need mercy. At the table, there's mercy. At the Father's table, at His banquet, there's mercy. And those who think they're worthy and those who know they're not worthy are still welcome to the same table. What a God. Well, there was something about verse 29 that he told his dad that might have stung his father. He said, "I've slaved for you all of these years." Oh my goodness. Had that been his attitude the whole time? Probably. I'm staying here to hold the family together. I'm the one who remained at home. I'm the good one. I'm the good son. And isn't Jesus telegraphing the good children of Israel, the faithful ones, to be careful? Dad's ready to throw a party when someone who doesn't deserve it comes home. Whoa. That we're going to have a party with or without your permission when the sinner comes home. And the older son missed all along what had been going on in his life. Slaving, he didn't answer. The father did not answer that charge specifically. But he said, "You own everything. Everything I have is yours. The second thing he told him is, your brother has been dead, in a sense. He's now alive. You know, the story ends here at this odd moment when the older brother wouldn't go to the party, the good son. And it doesn't say whether he would embrace his brother. You're just left to wonder. But the reason that the story is left hanging like this is because the ball is in our court now, using a basketball analogy. The ball is in our court. What are we going to do when the party gets thrown for the one who's not worthy? Did Jesus not prove this over and over in his ministry when he forgave the woman caught in the very act of adultery, as we studied last week? That Jesus was so willing to let her off the hook when the law of Moses actually said to stone such. And Jesus said, just don't do this anymore. Don't sin like this. Don't sin anymore like this. And I don't condemn you, he said. To understand why the story ends like this, you have to see who the audience is. Back in the first two verses of Luke 15, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. These are the worst of the worst. All gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. It was quite a mix of people listening to Jesus. The religious folks were angry because Jesus was welcoming into his audience the most wicked, unpatriotic, greedy, slimy people in their culture to hear about hope like this. He wasn't turning them away, and he wasn't thundering away at their unrighteousness. He was welcoming them back home. And the question for not for the tax collectors and sinners, they knew they had nowhere else to go. They were without hope in that culture. And Jesus offered it. The people he was talking to were the folks who thought they had it made spiritually, who were the faithful ones, who got the stuff right. They got the doctrine right. They got the fasting right. They got the prayers right. They got the law right. He's talking to them. Now what are you going to do when all of these sinners come in and have dinner with you? And Jesus was challenging them. He says, I know what you're going to do. You're going to stay outside and sulk because they haven't been faithful like you. They haven't been good like you. You haven't sinned like they've sinned. It's kind of like the Pharisees and the tax collector in the temple. The tax collector, the Pharisee, he lifts up his hands to God and says, thank you, God, that I'm not like anybody else. I'm not like this tax collector over here. I'm glad I'm not like him. Thank you, God, for making me different, for making me good. And the tax collector falls to his knees and he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus asks the tax collector, he asks the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the religious folks, he says, which one of them went home justified? It was the tax collector. The worst, the unpatriotic, the traitor, the greedy. The worst of the worst to people in that culture. It's quite a mix of people in that group that day. The religious folks, angry that hope was being given to the hopeless. Oh God, please let that not be us. It's about a God who doesn't grudgingly welcome those who are lost back into his family. He is so glad when the lost and the desperate who have no other options decide that home is where they need to be. And they want to come home because they don't have any hope anywhere else. Who are willing to admit with no excuses that they'd love to sit at the Father's table and dine with us and enjoy grace with us. Else they starve to death. They have no other hope. I met a couple like this about 10 or 15 years ago. I met a man at his home. I was visiting. He was about 60 years of age and dying of cancer. He was once a man who owned his own business. He was quite active. But the cancer took its toll, as cancer does, and he ended up pretty much unable to do anything except get himself to the bathroom, and then it was kind of a dangerous proposition. And when I visited with him, he was troubled, this once self-sufficient worldly man. He told me he'd been raised in church in his early years, but it had been so many years since he'd cracked a Bible, he didn't know anything about it anymore. And he told me that quite openly. And I could tell that his pain and anxiety were very much clear. It was just written all over his face. And I asked him about life and how things had gone. And then I asked him about his spiritual journey, and he said, well, he had been baptized many years before as a child, but he had pursued earthly things, ceased going to church. He had been raised with the stories of Jesus, and yet he says, I couldn't tell you one of them now. I'd never met anybody like it. Wealth had been his idol. They had had one child, but they were so worried about money that when his wife became pregnant a second time, he prevailed upon her to have an abortion. And that was the last bridge that he burned. He said after that happened, after they had this abortion, they couldn't even talk about it. They couldn't look at each other. They were so hopeless. But they lived life frantically, accumulating things to try to fill up the hollow spot that was deep inside of him. And I told him, I said, you know, even with all of that, you can come back to God. And he said, I don't know how this could be. You know what I've done. And he says, and I have only told you half of it. And he began to cry uncontrollably. And I let him cry, and we talked a while, and I said, but you can come back to God. He didn't think God could forgive him. I spoke to him of being home with God and that God wanted him home, but he just couldn't grasp it. So I asked him if he'd ever heard the story of the prodigal son. And he shocked me. He said, no, I don't remember that story. I thought everybody knew the story of the prodigal son, but he didn't. He couldn't remember it. It had been so long. And I told him of the son who ran away from home, who disgraced his dad and his family. And when he was at the end of his rope, he went home. How he'd rehearsed his prayer of penitence. He headed home, unsure of what awaited him there. How the father ran out to meet him and hugged him and kissed him and welcomed him home. And this young man had wasted his life, disgraced his dad, and done unspeakably wasteful things with his dad's life and his wealth. He didn't deserve to go home, but he didn't have anywhere else to go. He was without hope except to go home. He begged to be treated as a hired servant. He wasn't worth restoring, and his father would hear none of this, and he was restored to sonship. And I told him the whole story. I looked this gentleman in the eye and said, the father in that story is your God in heaven, your Father. And his eyes welled up with tears, as did his wife's, and he began to cry again. And he called his wife in, and he prayed a prayer. I asked him, I said, I want you to pray this prayer of penitence for the sins that you've committed, that you want to come home, and just tell God you want to come home. You can't take being home for granted when you see the relief of those who come home after they've lost all hope. I'm persuaded that if the older brother had looked his brother in the eye and seen what that man had been through, that he might have welcomed him home. To see a man that was beaten and thin and hopeless, who'd gotten his life back. You see, the story is about two lost sons, not just one. one who was lost and came home, the one who never left home but never thought about it being his home. It was for the older son a grim obligation to be endured, not a joy to have everything his daddy owned be his. He wanted justice for the sinner. He wanted to defend his daddy's honor, but his father's honor is his father's business, not ours. God's honor is his business. His glory is in his willingness to forgive. Some of you might say that the man and woman who had the abortion didn't get what they deserved and lived their life worldly in the accumulation of wealth. The abortion that was just one thing of many things that were very, very wrong. But when they came to the end of his life, he realized he didn't have any hope. And all those years, he decided that day to come home. But you see, without grace, all of us are lost. Thank God for his grace that overwhelmed the Son that he might die for us and get what we deserve and take it upon himself. You see, we receive what we need at the cross, not what we deserve. When a lost one comes home, God rejoices so much that he throws a party. And we, all of us, who enjoy the blessings of being at home with Christ, we rejoice too. Because the return of every lost soul to God is a reminder of how we are loved. It's not that he loved the lost son more. It's that he was most concerned about him. And so we should be as well about those who've lost their way. So, how do we increase our mercy? How do we increase our ability to show mercy? Well, it is an increased awareness that causes this, an increased awareness that we've got nothing that God hasn't given us. Just realize that with greater awareness. And if you want to increase your mercy, if you do increase your mercy, rather, you will increase your own gladness and joy at the restoration of others. Note well the mercy to the lost one, and you understand that God has mercy for you too. Yet the Lord is concerned about that lost one. And our desire is for the one God is concerned about, that one who is gone from home. So how about you? Have you wandered from home? The Father waits. He's looking. He's looking down that long, lonesome road. It's a crooked road that leads back home, but it's a trip worth taking. Because it's there where the hope is. It's where our life is. It's where the feast is. And so God calls you to come home to the Father. And we give you that opportunity right now as Lee comes and leads us in a song. Let's stand, please.